Hi, my name is Shalhevet Schwartz, and this is Gefet Ep.82, a joint project of Hadran and Yeshivat Drisha. While we left behind the laws of ribit, of interest and loans a few preking back, we're going to be exploring today a particular kind of facet of that that we didn't get to then, and that actually has its roots in the perek that we are in right now, perek about iskaot, about business transactions and business partnerships. And that is the Heter Iska, which is the legal mechanism or the legal workaround that used very widely today and really allows for, given the issur of ribit, allows for a functioning capitalistic economy that with which people can profit from lending money to one another. So with that, let's jump right into our sugya on Daf Kuf Daled, which describes the Heter Iska, the first iteration of the Heter Iska as it appears in the Gemara. Amri Nahardi, right? The Nahardian said, "Hi, Iska paga milva upaga pikadon." So this business part, this Iska, it is half milva and half pikadon, half loan and half deposit. So right, Chachamim have kind of instituted something that is beneficial both for the lova, the borrower, and for the malve, the lender. Now let's understand a little bit what this half milva, half pikadon institution is, how it works, and how it is, why it is nechale both for the lova and for the malve. So, right, the difference between a pikadon on the one hand and a halva on the other hand, right? A halva, a loan, that's where the issur of ribit, that's where the prohibition of interest comes up, right? A loan is money that I, lend to someone else, and right, I'm not allowed to collect any interest on it. That's right, obviously rule number one of loans. But right, how does it work? A loan, I am right. The borrower is chayav ba'acharito, is basically responsible for paying it back in full, no matter what happens, right? If I take money to invest and the investment goes sour, the investment goes bad, and now I lose that money, that really doesn't change the responsibility that I have to pay back the person from whom I borrowed the money. All right, that's a loan on the one hand. Pikadon on the other hand, right? A pikadon, I can derive profits from renting out, let's say, a car. If I have a car and I rent it out to someone else, of course I can take profit for my letting someone else use my car. Right, that's how rentals work in the first place. But on the other hand, there will be circumstances under which the borrower is actually not responsible to pay me back. Right, in cases of rentals in general, right, the borrower is not chayav for onsin, right, is not chayav for any kind of emergency or totally unforeseen circumstances that make it the case that something bad happens to the object that he borrowed. Right, if I renting your car and a tornado hits and destroys the car, I am p'tura from having to pay back for the car. So right, what the Nahardi are doing here with how this Iska works is where I'm essentially giving person A is giving money to person B to invest and defining half of it as a halva'a and half of it as a pikadon, which functionally means that we end up splitting the profits and the losses, because half of the money I'm going to get the principal back no matter what, and I don't get any profits on it. Half of the money I can get profits if the investment goes well, but if the investment goes badly, I lose half the money. So on the one hand, there's some amount of security for the lender who knows that he will get at least some portion of the principal back, and on the other hand can collect interest on the other end. Now the lova can take a loan with interest or partial interest, but will not have to pay back the loan in full if something happens. Now, the Gemara continues, right? So what the Gemara says right now that we have defined half of the money as a milva, so what the Gemara asks is okay to do with that milva. Right, theoretically, the money is being given for this joint business venture, but on the other hand, a milva, right, a loan can be used for whatever it is that the borrower wants to use the money for, right? Because the borrower has to pay back in full no matter what happens, then he can use it for whatever he wants. So, right, theoretically, the Nahardi are saying that because half the money is a loan, if I want to use this money to, instead of investing it to just buy alcohol, I can do it. Whereas Rava disagrees. Rava says, Iska, this is why they've called it a joint business venture. I gave you the money to invest, and not to just, go out to a bar. So that's the sugya that we have here. That is the kind of the basis in the Gemara of the Heter Iska, and we'll see how various iterations of that have developed throughout the centuries. But this is the primary source of the Iska that allows for lending money with interest, so to speak, without violating the prohibition of interest. We're going to turn now to a sugya that we saw actually a few weeks back, to a story that the Gemara tells back in the prekim that discuss ribit and halvaot. Through this sugya and through the shitot of the Rishonim on the sugya, we'll kind of gain a window into one of the sort of central principles, kind of operating at the core, at the heart of the issur of ribit in the first place. That also kind of functions as a sort of necessary condition with which the Heter Iska, throughout its various iterations throughout history, is going to have to contend and maintain. So with that, Rav Chama. So the Gemara tells a story about Rav Chama, who was Hava Mogio Zuzi B'Pshita B'Yoma. So he would essentially lend out money with interest, but the Gemara doesn't use the word lend, right? Doesn't use the word malveh. He would rent out money with interest, right? So that's essentially what he saw himself as doing. It's not a loan with interest. It's a rental. I'm renting out my money. That said, the Gemara continues, Kalu Zuzi to Rav Chama, right? This Rav Chama should not have been doing this, and his little business did not succeed, perhaps as a result of that. What though was Rav Chama thinking? Good guy, certainly not trying to be over on the issur of ribit. So who savar, the Gemara says, Ma'ashnami Mara. Why is renting out money any different from renting out a agricultural tool? Mara is a hoe. I can rent out a car, so why can't I rent out cash? Vilohi, but the Gemara rejects, thinks Rav Chama actually in the end was wrong. We see Kal Zuzir Rav Chama. This was not lo kedinasa. Right, and what's so the Gemara answers the question, what is the difference between renting out money and renting out an agricultural tool? So the Gemara gives two differences. One, Mara Heter Be'ene, right, a Mara, an agricultural tool that I rent out, when the person who pays it back doesn't pay back the value of the agricultural tool, he gives back the actual thing that he borrows. So that's difference number one. And number two, related to number one, is via diapathe, right? That the wear and tear that the object undergoes is obvious, is known to the parties involved, right? So if I rent a car that has 30,000 miles on it, and then you give it back to me with 35,000 miles on it, that, right, you're giving back the same car, and it has undergone some kind of change. Something has happened to it, and because of that, you are permitted to. We're permitted I'm permitted to charge you money for that rental. Whereas on the other hand, with money, zuze lo hadri beinahu, right? The money, the actual money that I give you, you're not giving me that money specifically, returning those coins, those bills, right? You're returning to me $1,000. $1,000 could be a different $1,000 as well. And related to that, lo yediapakte, right? It doesn't matter if the silver itself has undergone a little bit of wear and tear. The value of the coin is the value of the coin, no matter what. So it's not going to be undergoing any kind of wear and tear. So that's shot of the sugya. Rashi on Heter Be'ene though gives, right, on what is the significance of the fact that I give you back that when I rent an object from you, I give it back it's the original object itself. So Rashi gives tells us what ultimately is significant about that fact. So when Rashi and Heter Be'ene, oto kli chozer v'atzmo be'en ve'eno halva'at lo b'damim ve'en achrayuto alav ve'im ne'enas v'nishbar me'chmat melacha hilkach ein scharo ribit. Right. The fact that I give you back the object itself, that's not really what's important according to Rashi. What's important are the hashlachot, the implications of that, right? Which is the fact that I give you back the actual object means that I am that I, the borrower, am not entirely chayav b'achrayuto, right? That under certain circumstances, if something happens, in particular, or other kinds of damage that the object can undergo, I actually wouldn't have to pay you back. So the lender or the person who's renting out the object under those conditions is taking on some kind of risk, right? If I give you a car and a tornado hits it, if I rent you a car and a tornado hits it, and because of that you are patur from giving it back, I've taken on a risk. And that part of what it means for that I'm able to charge money, it's not just the wear and tear that the object undergoes, but it's also that there's some risk involved, risk of wear and tear, risk of onsin, and that ultimately paying money for a loan or a rental, right, that is inextricably in some way tied up or bound up with the notion of risk that the lender or the renter is taking on. We see that also in Tosfot's understanding of what was going through Rav Chama's head when Rav Chama said Ma'ishna Mimara, right, how is this different from renting out something else? Tosfot specifies that actually what was going on is that the lender himself was mekabel haya alav achariyut onsin. He thought, what does it mean that I'm renting out money? I'm renting out money and taking on responsibility for onsin. I'm stipulating that I'm not going to be chayav for a case of onsin, and therefore, that on some level the lender here, Rav Chama, was voluntarily taking on some aspect of the risk, and therefore he shouldn't be prohibited from collecting a price on that quote unquote loan. Right. The Riffa disagrees. We'll look at it, but we won't look at it inside. Right. He thinks that what was going on, right, part of what was going through Rav Chama's head is that not that he was taking on achariyut, but that he was giving the money not for the purposes of a loan such that the borrower would spend it for whatever he wanted, but that actually the silver itself was going to be used, let's say for some kind of decorative purpose or something like that. So really the silver was being used qua kli, right? It was being used as an object and not as money. But right through this machloket between Tosfot and the Riffa, right, we see also both in Rashi and in Tosfot, we see that kind of fundamental factor here is the nature of the risk that the lender or the renter is taking on, and that is ultimately what makes it possible or what makes it allowed for the renter to be lending money with interest. Right? The Kli Yakar actually gives us a kind of takes this idea one step further and gives us even like a theological explanation for what it means that what it means about the issur ribit, that the permissibility of collecting money on a loan or a rental is really bound up with this notion of risk on the part of the lender. So Vizil Batartama, Ikar ta'am issur haribit, the Kli Yakar says, right, the basis for, or the basic reason for the issur of ribit, who the fishu misir midata bitachon min ha'adam tichol ba'al masau matan inav misuot el Hashem the fishu misupak mirvia. Right, what does lending money with interest do? It takes away the idea of needing to have faith and rely on God, because part of what it means to be a member of to be a business person, to be a person who's engaging in economic transactions is inav misuot el Hashem. Right, one needs to be right thinking, recognizing that there's risk inherent in what he's doing, and therefore kind of reliant on God, right? Because he doesn't know if he's actually going to make money from it or not. But if a person lending money with interest, right, you could invest money without risk, and if you can invest money without risk, then we know it's no longer necessary to have that kind of religious or spiritual consciousness. And according to the Kli Yakar, right, that's really part of, right, it's not, the issur of ribit isn't only about, obviously it's in part about not wanting to oppress, it's not only ben adam l'chavero, not only about wanting to not, oppress one's fellow, but it's also about the religious virtues of the lender himself. Right, and so we see that in the story of Rav Chama, the way that the Rishonim understand it, that right, why is it that even though Rav Chama thought that what he was doing was okay, because why is it different from a rental? Right, there's something significant about the notion of taking on risk that allows us to profit halachically from transactions. So now, with all that, we're going to head to take a look at the actual different mechanisms of Heter Iska that have existed throughout the centuries, and see how in each of them, right, that give and take is right, like is a live question that the poskim are operating with. So on the one hand, we want to make it possible for people to lend money with interest and without incurring too much risk, because we want to make those loans possible and beneficial. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, there's always going to need to be some opening for risk on the part of the lender, so that kind of larger theological idea remains intact. And we'll see how that plays out in these different iterations. So we'll start with the halachot gedolot that describes in more succinct terms the Iska that is described in the Gemara. So the Iska described in the Gemara, if we remember from our daf, is half milva and half pikadon. So so he's explaining the Gemara, right? Nechale lemalve, diamar nishve kula iska halva'a asir lemalve lemeichal rivcha dehavala ribit. So if it were entirely a halva'a, it would be asir ribit. So that's why it's good for the malve. V'iyamar mar lishve lefule pikadon. But if it were entirely a deposit, entirely a pikadon, then then the malva would get nothing back, right? Then the lender would get nothing back. All right, right? So that's why it's partially milva, so that partially a milva, partially a loan, so that if something happens to it, if onsin happened to it, at least I, the lender, get half back. Right, that half of it is a pikadon, because theoretically I am still I who lent the money or rented handed over the money to the other person to invest for me. It's still my money, and therefore I can take profits from the profits that investment makes. Right, so that's why it's good for the malva. Right, that if we were to say it were entirely a halva'a, then I would be responsible for everything. Then right, but if I were to say it's entirely a pikadon, then the other guy would get all the profits. So on the one, so the malva and the lova share the profits and share the risk. So right, what we see here, right, that it's part pikadon, part halva'a. There's the lender has partial security, partial insurance in the event that the business collapses, but again, it's only partial. And on the other hand, the lender can collect profits on the other half that he's really taking on the risk for. That's iteration number one. Iteration number two, which we see in the Shurma Hadeshen, right, is the takana of the Shurma Hadeshen. He wants the Heter Iska to look a little bit different from what we've described so far, and he says no, we're not going to define it as half halva'a and half pikadon. We're actually going to define the entire thing as a pikadon. Reuben notin yekabel av kol ha'achrayut afilu shel gneva ve'aveda ve'afriz al midah lekabel alav she'afilu im yavdu o yignevu ve'yafsidu afilu b'pshia yeh ba'achrayut. So we're going to define the entire thing as a pikadon, and not only that, but what happens with the pikadon? In that case, the lender is taking on a measure of risk, that if something happens, right, the borrower is not entirely chayav b'achrayut, and so he's really upping the ante to say that, like, in order for interest to be possible, the lender is actually taking on achrayut not only for onsin but also for gneva v'aveda, really for anything that could happen to the pikadon. Right, so the lender is taking on a large portion of a kind of larger portion of risk in order to be able to benefit or profit from this transaction. That said, how are we going to protect the lender? So he comes up with a cool mechanism here that enables the lender to at least make it more than likely that he's going to get at least the principal back. So how does that work? There's certainly going to be some circumstances in which the borrower is going to have to pay back money if he does something extremely negligent with it. And so וגם יקבל עליו שלא יהיה נאמן אפילו בשבועו רטב ואפילו על פי עדים ואפילו הן 100 שלא פשע בהם פשיעה גדולה שהוא מחזיק בידיים, רק אם יעידו לו הרב והשץ וכלי הגבנה, אנשים יושבי אוהלים בעיר שיש להם ידיעה במקום ממכר שבעיר, הם היו נאמנים להעיד בראיה בידיעה גמורה. So here's the trick. I am if I'm lending money to you, right, you are not chayav b'achrei yitad under most circumstances, but if you are really, really posheya, if you're really negligent or responsible for it, then you are. Now, how do we know that you weren't posheya? So theoretically, under most circumstances with pikadon, you can take a shvua, but what you are taking on yourself as the borrower is that we're not going to rely on a shvua. We're not even going to rely on normal edim. We're going to rely only on edim of the Rav and the Rav and the Shatz and people who are officials of the town. Right? I need hardcore edut from officials of the town that I wasn't. Or sorry, you need hardcore edut from the officials of the town that you weren't posheya, that you weren't negligent for the loss of the money. And if you can't provide those, then you're going to have to pay back the keren. Not because you're pay back the principal, not because you're actually responsible to pay back the principal, but because you didn't succeed at proving that you weren't negligent with it. So through that, right, what we see is it's a partial guarantee that the lender receives the principal, even if the business ultimately collapses, because he's going to need to provide a really high bar of testimony that he's probably not going to be able to reach. But theoretically, at least, and it could happen that something happens to the money and I really don't want to pay it back. I don't have the money to pay it back, and I actually can provide that testimony. So there still is on the part of the lender this element of risk. Now, right, iteration number 3 is going to be the takanat of the Maharam mi Krakow, not the Maharam mi Württemberg. And this goes back to something closer to that of the Gemara, and that we're not defining it entirely as a pikadon, but we're having it be partially pikadon, partially halva'ah, but we're not splitting the money as half pikadon, half halva'ah, but we're splitting the time, right? Part of the period of the loan is going to be the period of pikadon, during which the malva, during which the lender can receive a profit, but when it profits up to a certain point, then it turns into a halva'ah, at which point the borrower's chayav b'achrei, right, is and doesn't have to pay more interest. So this also allows for the development of a kind of particular bar for how much the interest payment or the non-interest payment is, right? It's with a shared business partnership, theoretically, I, the lender, am deriving benefits up to infinity, whereas this, it's something closer to a set amount of interest on a loan, but it's still based on this idea of partial pikadon and partial halva'ah, right? Here's the nosach. Anachnu chatumim mata modim shekibalnu mizumani bi'ad ploni bar ploni be'iska tov tov achri tov kol esek tov u'schora tov ashish zamein li'adenu behem yu me'otav kedumim me'otenu rev'kach nidneheg tamid ad sheya'aleh revach mehen sach ploni. Right, so it's going to be a pikadon, and the borrower can get profits up until it hits a particular amount. Okay, so similar to the previous iteration that we looked at, right? Even during the time period when it is a pikadon, when theoretically at least the malva is taking on a certain measure of risk, in order to attest to the fact that losses incurred were actually incurred in a way that I, the borrower, was not responsible for, I'm going to need to provide aiding. And if I don't want to provide aiding or can't provide aiding, then instead I could just decide to pay the keren, so pay the principal. So again, under almost all or most circumstances, the lender has a near guarantee that he's going to get at least the principal back, so long as the person can't provide aiding. To the effect that he wasn't responsible for it. That's on the one hand, and on the other hand, we get to the lender gets to profit up to a certain point, and we get to also cap the profit that the lender undergoes. So it's partial guarantee that the lender receives profits should the business succeed, and it's also a partial guarantee that the lender ultimately receive the principal in a situation in which the business collapses. That's number 3, and number 4. Which is what's the most commonly used today, and let's say in Bank Leumi in Israel today. This is the Heter Iska that gets used. It actually goes back in many respects to the Heter Iska of the Gemara, but contains another interesting workaround that makes the risk that enables for something that looks more like a set interest price and reduces the risk that the lender is taking on. So the way that this works is it's it goes back to half pikadon, half halva'ah model of the Gemara. So theoretically, we are sharing in profits and sharing in losses. But what? Right, theoretically, if the borrower is investing the money on behalf of the lender, right, again, they're going to have to provide some sort of way of attesting to the fact that the sum of the profits was this and no more. It's not like I'm stealing money from you because actually I profited more, but I'm only giving you X amount of money on the one hand, or if it incurs a loss, I'm going to have to attest to the fact that I really did incur a loss and it wasn't my fault and I'm not responsible to pay you back. So what do we do? Instead of that, we set a sum of money, that it sort of works as demei pshara, a sort of compromise price that instead of needing to track the absolute details and needing to attest with a shvua or with edim that really this was how much money I made, or really the losses that I incurred were my fault. So instead, we've determined we've predetermined a set of a set price that I can pay in order to get out of my responsibility to verify any of that information. And that compromise price ultimately ends up being the interest money, right? I pay back, I say, I don't want to deal with any of that, so I'll just pay back the Karen, and the compromise price that we set in advance that I could give you that money instead of having to deal with the whole balagan of providing witnesses. So, right, let's read the nusach here. אנו החתומים למטה מתחייבים בזה שכל ענייני הכספים שיש בהן איסור ריבית יהיה בידי המקבל בתור עסקה. So really this is the business venture. חלקו של המקבל יהיה מחצית מהרווח, right? The part that the person the borrower or the person receiving the money gets half of the profits. ובהפסד right, ובהפסד חס ושלום יישא מקבל שליש והנותן שני שליש. So it's actually not 50-50 an even split here, right? Even though it's chatzi, right? It's not chatzi pikadon chatzi milva exactly, because the split's not even because the investor on some level is getting paid for his troubles, right? If I'm making a shared investment on behalf of two of us, so it can't be an exactly 50-50 split because I'm doing the work for the both of us. Theoretically, you're getting half the profits, but I'm not taking on entirely half the risk because I'm the one doing the work of investing. So that's the case for the person getting a loan here. But we see right? The borrower has to prove that they did everything kedat u'kedin, that they weren't negligent with the loan. Also, like theoretically, the standard or the burdens of proof are like what the Maharam said, which is that you need edim sheri, etc. Right? Oh, right? But if the borrower wants to, instead of proving that he behaved fine with the money, wants to pay a specific predetermined set of compromise price, right? Then he's patur from this burden of proving or attesting or verifying that he wasn't pushaya with the money. And then he can just keep whatever other money he made from this venture, right? So ultimately, when you have these demei pashrut, right, it provides a strong guarantee that the lender profits on the entire amount if the business succeeds, right? That now we can have this demei pashrut that we determined in advance, and the lender is going to get that money. And it's a strong guarantee that the lender receives the principal if the business collapses, right? Because even if something bad happens, it's much more likely then that the person is going to go and provide aid, is that the person is going to just choose to go with this demei pashrut and pay back the principal plus this, pay back the principal. But you see here, and there have been stories actually of situations in which people in which borrowers whose businesses have collapsed have chosen to give up on this compromise price and actually wanted to go meikar hadin, provide testimony that they weren't poshaya, and in those cases, theoretically, the lender, in this case the bank, would actually still be taking on risk. So we see here that, right, even as we try to reduce the risk or make it more convenient for the borrower simply to pay the principal back than to try to deal with kind of verification or attestation to the fact that he wasn't poshaya with the loan, Right. Ultimately, when push comes to shove, right, when you hit bottom, there's always going to be that element of risk, right? In defining this money as a picadon in order to make it possible for the to take out a loan, right? There's always going to be an element on some level, an element of risk that the lender is taking on. And ultimately, right, that allows us to maintain some level of what the Kli Yakar was talking about, this kind of the ultimate kind of like spiritual virtue that it is kind of inherent in all business dealings and all business transactions that the Torah wants us to hold on to, even as we try to profit from loans. So we'll just close with, and so with brief summary, right? The sugya defines money as half halva'a and half picadon, and on the half that is a picadon, right? On that half you can collect interest, you're splitting profits, splitting risks. The version of the Trumat Adeshen, right? We're defining the entire loan as a picadon, with the lender taking on responsibility for damages. The way we sort of get out of the massive risk that the lender is incurring is that verification that in fact the borrower wasn't poshea there's a very high bar to verify. You need the Shalhevet Tzibur and the Rav or the Rav. You need a serious official to attest to the fact that was the case. And we have the Takanat Maharam, which defines it as half picadon, half halva, or part picadon, part halva, but not in terms of the money itself, but in terms of the period of time of the loan. And again, a high bar for verifying that during the period of picadon, the losses incurred did not result from pshia on the part of the borrower, and therefore it's more likely that the borrower will actually just pay back the Karen. And the version today, which goes back to half picadon, half halva, but with these demegit pashrut, the sort of compromise sum that the borrower can pay instead of that whole verification process, which essentially guarantees a set profit in addition to, essentially guarantees a set profit in addition to paying back the principal. We can see that there's a spectrum of different attitudes that Chachamei Yisrael had to the idea of Heter Iska in the first place. The Gra was a vociferous opponent of the whole idea, even though that's actually a little bit more complicated. We know that he was he permitted it to, at least he was a signatory, I think, on a Heter Iska of one of his students. But there is definitely kind of one voice or through line throughout the Jewish tradition that is more anti, thinks of it as a legal workaround that is maybe goes against the spirit and perhaps even the letter of the law with the issur ribit. So that's one. There are those who think it's okay, but the Yael, right, in a manner similar to Hillel's attitude towards the Prose Bowl, right? Theoretically, the issur of ribit is important, but what can we do? People have sort of stopped lending to one another, and we need to make it possible for people to lend to one another. So we're going to let them do it in a situation in which it's absolutely necessary. There are those who think that it's actually okay, right? It's important that we have a functioning economy that runs on capital. We need people to be able to make loans and to be able to profit from them. That's part of what it means to function in a modern economy. And the Chatam Sofer permitted it a few for Ba'alei Nefesh, even for people who are particularly religious, punctilious, machmir, right? The Chatam Sofer thinks, no, it's a good thing. It's important that we have an economy that can run and that people be able to earn a living through, right? We need banks. We need people who earn a living through the lending of money and the flow of money, in order for our modern economy to function. A couple of sort of final questions that we haven't explored, but that those who are interested in getting a deeper understanding of Heter Iska are recommended to look into more. So, right, one is we saw that the fact that the Heter Iska was introduced in a perek not about halvaot ribit, but about iskaot, about business partnerships and business transactions, right? The money of an iska really is originally intended to be a joint investment, or to be an investment that I'm making through somebody else. I'm giving the money to someone else to invest, and theoretically I can profit on that investment because we're sort of in this joint business venture together. But most of the loans that I take out from the bank these days are not really about investing this money in particular, right? I have a job and I want to get a mortgage on a house, and I'm not investing the money in the house. I'm just going to pay back that loan over time. So is it possible to use a Heter Iska for money that I'm not planning to invest, but I'm planning just to spend and to pay back over time? That's question number one. And question number two is that the way that Heter Iska operates, let's say in Israeli banks, right, is not typically with any particular loan. They write out a Heter Iska in which both parties are fully aware of what's going on, but that there's sort of a general Heter Iska kind of pinned up on the wall of the bank that says like this is how this is how the transactions made or the loans made by this bank operates. So is that okay, or do I need the Iska to be a specific transaction that's happening between two specific people? So both of these questions worth exploring further. Ultimately, both of these end up being made possible in various ways, but worth further study. And both of these questions also ultimately get us into show us, I think, even further, right, the limits, the scope and the limits of Heter Iska, and kind of what that can show us about the ultimate purpose and intention behind both it and the issur, the prohibition of interest in the first place. Thanks so much, and be well. See you next week.